Good morning. It is good to gather here with you virtually online yet again. As we gather for a time of worship and reflection, I light this candle, and if you have a candle at home, I invite you to do the same to remind us of the light and the presence of Christ that is with us in all times, in all places, and in all situations. For our scripture reading this morning, it is from the Gospel of John, chapter 11. I'm going to read some selected verses, but I encourage you to read through that whole section, chapter 11, verses 1 through 45. But this is the story of the death of Lazarus and Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. So I invite you to hear now these words. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. So their sister sent a message to Jesus, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." But when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of Man may be glorified through it." Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." And Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise in the resurrection on the last day." And Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She answered him, "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" And they said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. And Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench, because he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me. But I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. And Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Well, this morning is the third Sunday of me sharing my message online and only online. It's particularly poignant because this was the Sunday, the fifth Sunday in March, when Crawford, Hotchkiss, and Paonia United Methodist churches were planning to join together for one shared worship and a potluck afterwards. And so this morning I'm keenly aware of the sense of community that is missing. And I'll be honest, this is a disorienting time for me, and I'm sure for many others. For the past 15 and a half years, every Sunday morning I have woken up, gotten dressed, and gone in some way, shape, or form to lead worship. And now I have no idea what to do. Most days I don't even know what day it is, and it's become very odd and awkward time and feeling for me and for many others. And I can see this reflected all around me. My two children have had polar opposite reactions to school closings, and this past week, the stay-at-home order from our governor. One has fully embraced this opportunity to lounge around the house in his pajamas all day long. Yesterday, we went out as a family and we took a walk at Black Canyon of the Gunnison National Park. And we told my son, go and change into something warm, some outdoor clothes. And he did that, and we got in the car and we enjoyed about a 2-mile walk out there. And then when we got home, I watched, he stopped at the laundry room and he took off his sweatshirt and he took off his sweatpants, and there underneath his clothing were his pajamas, right? He was holding strong and refusing to take them off. And he reassumed his lounging position there in the house in the pajamas that he had still been wearing all day. Now, my other child has had the complete opposite reaction. He has a countdown to the day when he thinks he'll be allowed to go back to school on April 20th. He's broken down a couple of times in tears because he loves his school and he misses his teacher and he misses his friends and just the social interaction. And he was devastated a couple of days ago when we told him he couldn't even go to the park up by our house because it had been closed. And he reminded me, he's like, Dad, in the last 2 weeks, I've only seen 9 other people. 3 of them have been in my family, and the other 6 have been so far away, I couldn't recognize them, much less talk to them. And the idea that he could go 5 to 6 months from the time the schools closed to when they may potentially reopen in August for a new school year, that he could go that long without going to school is causing him serious distress. My family isn't alone in this mix of emotions and feelings. Like we have hit some sort of death in place in our lives right now. We only have to look around our own community and our own world to see people are losing their jobs. Businesses are closing, some temporarily, some permanently. People have been prevented from gathering for worship. We're not allowed to visit friends and family and loved ones. We're watching as hospitals and parts of our state and around the nation and around the world are flooded with people who are ill. Many are losing their lives, and it's easy for us to have this sense that life in some way has reached some sort of dead end. This time is really extraordinary. And when I had set out to plan this time of Lent, this time of preparation for Easter, I'd framed it as being a boot camp for the soul. Sometimes we embark on journeys where we try to focus or sharpen some aspect of our lives, spiritual lives or physical lives, maybe a relational or even an intellectual pursuit. And sometimes we find that when we do that, we run into dead ends. Those times when everything that you have worked for, everything that you have worked at, just doesn't work out. Sometimes that is a misstep that we take. Sometimes it's because there is a global pandemic that breaks out, and situations are beyond our control. And I know there's ways right now that I feel like I have hit a dead end in some sense, not knowing where to go, where to turn, what to do, feeling confined, restricted, cut off from other people. And I imagine that there are many of us who are feeling that as well right now. And as we live through this really extraordinary time, I think it's important for us to remember this story that we hear in the Gospel of John, the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. And it's a really extraordinary story and an extraordinary moment in the Gospel. And I think the power of this passage for us as people of faith is that it shows us Jesus' vision of God's power, a power beyond what we as human beings can oftentimes understand or comprehend. You know, the story is interesting because Jesus hears that his friend Lazarus is sick and he's on his deathbed. And Jesus, upon hearing this, he lingers. He doesn't go immediately to Lazarus. He doesn't go and heal him so that he doesn't die. Jesus lingers for a couple of days. And I always wonder why. Why didn't he just go and do what we know from the gospel that he could do? He could heal Lazarus from whatever it was that was ailing him, that he could have raised him from his deathbed before he ever reached that point of death. And I don't have a really good answer for that. It's an aspect of this story that I struggle with every time I read it. But I think that we might get a glimpse or of an answer or have an idea of why he lingered, because perhaps Jesus wanted to show his followers something about God and God's vision and God's power for this world. He wanted to show his followers something about how God works in the world. And not only how God works, but into what types of situation God is willing to enter and God is willing to work. And so after a couple of days, Jesus gets up and he makes this journey to go and find Lazarus. And he does this at risk to himself. And some of the scriptures verses that I didn't read this morning, Jesus knows that making the journey to Lazarus' bedside is risky because there are people who are looking to kill him. But Jesus makes that risk and he goes, and when he arrives, he finds that Lazarus has already passed away. And in fact, he's already been buried and he's been in the tomb for 4 days. But it's in this moment of coming to Lazarus' grave that I think we see that Jesus is looking beyond just that present moment and is to a future in which the work of God can accomplish the impossible. I think Jesus is showing us, not just telling us, but showing us that God is merciful and God's power is infinite. And God's power can create hope in places that seem hopeless for us. A grave is often not a place where one goes to find hope. And yet Jesus goes to that very place and shows his followers the power of God. Jesus knew God's presence and power would be at work and would be accessible, even in those places of grief and mourning and death. Jesus goes with mourners to Lazarus' grave, and when he gets there, he is moved with emotion, and he himself begins to weep. A great moment of looking at Jesus' humanity and just the compassion that he had for his friends and his followers. But Jesus knows that God is present in that very place of grief and mourning. And Jesus then shows them that power at work as he calls Lazarus from the grave. Now, it's interesting that no one is who's present there as Jesus is calling Lazarus forth is said to even believe in Jesus' power. And so it tells us something that this power that's at work in this moment where Jesus is raising Lazarus from the dead, it's not dependent upon my belief or your belief or anyone's belief, but it's dependent upon the power of God. Jesus and the power that he embodies on the earth is the source of Lazarus rising. Jesus creates the ability for others to then, having witnessed this, come to a place of belief. And he does this by turning death into life. And we see that Jesus will do this again and again in the Gospels. He'll do it again and again in our lives as individuals. He'll do it again and again in our lives as a community of faith. Jesus will turn death into life in our communities, in our state, our nation, and around the world. We are in a very awkward and weird and uncertain and in many ways scary time as human beings, as people of faith, as residents of our community, as members of our families. And it's a time where many of us probably have no idea what to do or what the future holds. And yet, I think when we read this story of Lazarus being raised by the power of Christ, Christ who can see God's vision for the world and God's vision for the future, it reminds us that we have hope, not in our own belief or in our own works, but we have hope in the work of God. We know the power of God and the power of Christ enters into our lives and into our places of mourning and grief, just as it will enter into our places of fear and unknowing. God will enter into our places of doubt and show us what the power of divine love and action can accomplish. And so in this moment where we are all probably a little uncertain, a little uncomfortable, where we feel like in some ways maybe we've hit a dead end in our life of faith, in our life of community, that God is at work. That God is saying to us, know that my power is at work, even in these places of grief, uncertainty, death, and unknowing. And so this day, I invite you to place your trust in that power of God. Now, I want to make one thing clear is that, Jesus calls Lazarus out of his cave. And I truly believe that one day Jesus will call each one of us out of our places of self-quarantine and social distancing. I don't think that day is here yet. And so I'm not encouraging anyone to run out into the streets and shake hands and hug. But I do believe that day is somewhere in our future, that we will again be called out when it is safe and appropriate, that we will be called back into a community that is face-to-face, and we will be called back to a community where we proclaim and enact together in the presence of one another the love and the power of God. Until then, we live knowing that God comes to us in our places of doubt, fear, and that God is with us. And that God is, even though we may not see it and feel it right now, always turning life into death. May God be with you. May God comfort you. May God give you the guidance that you seek and need for this day and every day. In the name of Christ, amen.